It was teamwork that took Tunisia, and there's part of the team, Alexander and Cunningham, just before the breakthrough that led to the extinction of the Axis in Africa. The German command was once again out-generaled when instead of going for Tabourba, the First Army drove on towards Tunis by way of Massiko. It was the success of this drive that completed the defeat of the enemy in Tunisia. When our tanks went forward to the final battles, the end came quicker than the most optimistic ever expected. And although it's natural that German and Italian propaganda should make much of the Allies' overwhelming superiority, they fail to explain how it was that the Axis, whose lines of communication were so much shorter than ours, were inferior. Allied air support was magnificent. The Luftwaffe was absolutely smashed on the ground and in the air. It had to get out even before the Battle of Tunisia was over. It just couldn't take it. The Royal Air Force and the Americans laid on a non-stop blitz that put all German blitzes right into the shade. Over Tunis. Here, the attack was concentrated on the dock area. We can see how successful it was from these RAF pictures. As the First Army got nearer to Tunis, the prisoners began to come in. We've read of small groups of the enemy holding out and fighting desperately to the end in isolated positions, and we've read of small groups of the enemy surrendering with comparative eagerness. But either way, the last Axis armies in Tunisia were liquidated, and for the Allies, the result was the same as it had been in Stalingrad. It was camarade, capitulation, call it what you like. The Axis plans were in ruins, and their individual hopes of glory faded into the gloom of unconditional surrender. No Axis Dunkirk was possible, and all that was seen of the great Italian Navy was the surrender of Italian naval officers and men who'd somehow got mixed up with the fighting on land. On the outskirts of Tunis itself, more and more men were rounded up. Some commentators have apparently swallowed the Axis propaganda bait that Hitler and Mussolini were merely concerned with a delaying action in Africa, an attempt to hold off the invasion of Europe as long as possible. But of course their plan was nothing of the sort. Actually, their object was the capture of Cairo and the Suez Canal, leading to a link-up with their armies on the Eastern Front and also with the Japanese. Now that they're out of Africa altogether, the measure of Allied triumph can be fully appreciated. The Axis have lost some 500,000 men in North Africa alone, and if we add the East African campaigns, the figure is at least half as much again. Here in Tunis, high German officers, including the town major and his staff, give themselves up. Evidently, they knew they'd come to stay. Here are a few more heroes who, according to the Axis radio, fought to the last cartridge. Actually, some Italian prisoners were rather comical. Look out, don't fire, it's dangerous, one of them seems to be saying. And another makes signs that he's only going to fetch his overcoat. I go, I come back. When our troops entered Tunis, they soon saw for themselves confirmation of the astonishing accuracy of the Allied bomber crews. The docks had been completely pulverized. town itself, on the other hand, had suffered hardly any damage at all. The boys also discovered a little of what it means to civilians to be liberated from German and Italian occupation. No words could improve on these newsreel pictures showing the extraordinary scenes of joy which greeted our men. An extraordinary feature was the fact that street fighting was by no means finished when the spontaneous celebrations began. For instance, 250 Germans were holding out in that partly built block of flats, and the strong point had to be blotted out. In fact, all over the place, miniature battles were going on and desperate efforts at resistance were being crushed, all at the same time as these amazing demonstrations of unrestrained joy throughout the city. Yes, the demonstrations were overwhelming. In the middle of all this, batches of prisoners were continually driving or marching bang through the middle of the crowds. Nobody seemed to take very much notice. They'd seen quite enough of them already. Here and there, people wished them a very long, good riddance. And then, as each lot of prisoners disappeared, the jollification was resumed. If it was like this in Tunis, which after all has only been occupied for about 6 months, how can we guess what it'll be like in France and all the other subjugated countries? One of the biggest results of final victory in Africa will be the strong renewal of hope and faith in occupied Europe. As for the British and their allies, who have given Hitler's crack troops one of the biggest beatings they've ever received, I wonder how they felt, coming straight out of the heat of battle into such a welcome as this. If Hitler were to see these newsreel pictures, he might realize just how popular he is. And here are the authors of our victory. Does Hitler remember, I wonder, that he once called them military idiots?